Today on the BetaFiles, we're looking at Glenn Greenwald, former journalist of The Intercept, who resigned from The Intercept on Thursday of this week, which is ironic because it's a paper that he helped co-found. If you don't know who he is, he's the guy that broke the Snowden story and then, of course, did a lot of investigative work on Bolsonaro during the Brazilian elections a few years ago. Hang on to your diapers, babies. I'm the barber. This is the BetaFiles.
And strike three. Dodgers have won it all in 2020.
Glenn Greenwald has thought a lot about that question. Greenwald is a traditional leftist. He's committed above all to forcing transparency on people who hold power. Years ago, Greenwald co-founded a news site called The Intercept. Today he resigned. In a statement, Greenwald explained why. Quote, "The Intercept's editors, in violation of my contractual right of editorial freedom, censored an article I wrote this week, refusing to publish it unless I removed all sections critical of Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden, the candidate vehemently supported by all New York-based Intercept editors involved in this effort at suppression." And he went on. Greenwald's full statement is up tonight at an internet platform called Substack, which is not yet censored. No matter who you plan to vote for next week, we recommend that you read it. Glenn Greenwald joins us tonight. Glenn, thanks so much for coming on. The idea of you resigning from a news organization you helped found is stunning. Tell us why you did.
Well, the news organization that I co-created was in 2013 at the height of the Snowden reporting. I left The Guardian to do it because I was seeing that there were a lot of constraints imposed on journalism and our ability to report freely against governments, against power centers, against all kinds of institutions that wield authority. And the premise of the news outlet, the core overarching premise, the reason it was created was to ensure that journalists would always have complete journalistic independence and editorial freedom, never have to pull punches journalistically or pay homage to pieties because of the preferences, the partisan or ideological preferences of editors or of anybody else. That was the core founding idea and vision. And then that is what makes it so amazing that at the very outlet that I co-created, that was built on my reputation, my credibility, my journalistic accomplishments, then tried to intervene to censor me 6 days before an election because I wanted to publish reporting and analysis about the evidence that raises serious questions about the conduct of the candidate that all of the editors at that outlet vehemently and enthusiastically support.
I would imagine that some of our viewers don't read The Intercept. You live outside our country, which is one of the reasons I think you say what you think is true. Tell us what this portends for the future here in the United States.
So The Intercept was actually, for a while, a unique publication, and I think the vision I just described is one reason, but another was that it was intended, above all else, to be highly skeptical of the claims of intelligence agencies. At the time when we were doing the reporting, the attacks were coming from the NSA, the CIA, the deep state against me, against my source Edward Snowden, and against the reporting. And we knew they were lying constantly and disseminating propaganda in a very powerful way. So we set out to say, we're going to investigate them. We're going to be skeptical of them. We're going to subject their assertions to critical scrutiny. And I am so embarrassed and angered that the media outlet that I created, along with two other excellent journalists, to do that, the only article it published about all of these documents that have emerged about Joe Biden, other than a column of mine where I denounced Facebook and Twitter for censoring it, was an article that made reference in passing to those documents very snidely and dismissively to say that no one should pay attention to it because it was Russian disinformation, and it cited a letter from John Brennan, James Clapper, Mike Hayden, and the rest of the goons from the CIA and the intelligence community asserting it. And worse still, that letter said, we have no evidence that Russia's involved in any of this. The Intercept omitted that phrase, simply cited that letter to try and encourage people to ignore this evidence on the grounds that Russia had manufactured it and that the evidence was fabricated, even though there's never been any evidence for that's been true. And everything since has disproven it, showing Russia was not involved in any of this. And nobody, certainly not even Joe Biden, disputes that these emails and other text messages are completely real and authentic.
It's horrifying. So what you're watching is agencies of the U.S. government turning their awesome and unconstrained powers against the American population.
This is the real story of the last 4 years of the Trump administration, which is that for a long time on the left, there was a healthy skepticism of the CIA.
Yes, there was.
There was a lot of anti-war activism in the Bush and Cheney years. That has all disappeared. And the reason it's disappeared is because the CIA, from the very first days of the Trump administration, even before he was inaugurated, devoted themselves to sabotaging the administration because Donald Trump questioned just a few of their pieties. And that can't be done in Washington. Whoever does that must be destroyed. And so the CIA and the deep state operatives became heroes of the liberal left, the people who support the Democratic Party. They're now in a full union with the neocons, the Bush-Cheney operatives, the CIA, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street. That is the union of power, along with mainstream media outlets that are fully behind the Democratic Party, which is likely to at least take over one branch of government, if not all of them, in the coming election. And that is a very alarming proposition because they're authoritarian, they believe in censorship, and they believe in suppression of information that exposes them in any kind of a critical light.
For a U.S. government agency to try and disseminate propaganda within the United States, I mean, is there any clearer attack on democracy than that?
So when we were doing the Snowden reporting, one of the things that induced Edward Snowden to come forward as someone who had worked in the CIA and the NSA was his anger and horror that the tools of the NSA had been turned on the American people. They're supposed to spy on foreign adversary governments, but they weren't. They were collecting our phone records. Same with the CIA. They're trained disinformation agents. That's what they do. They lie for a living. But they're supposed to do that in other countries where we want to induce some sort of change, overthrow a government, topple a regime, whatever quote-unquote interference the U.S. government wants to do, the way we're also upset that Russia did in 2016. That's what they're trained to do. The law, though, and the obvious foundational prohibition on having a security state, a national security state after World War II, was it was never supposed to be turned domestically. They weren't supposed to be involved in our politics or disseminating propaganda. Go turn on any of those other cable networks or pick up the op-ed page of any of the biggest newspapers, and all you'll see are ex-members of the CIA, the DOJ, the FBI, the NSA telling Americans what they ought to believe. They've infiltrated the means of communication domestically. They do it through leaks. They do it through clandestine operations and through lies. They propagandize the American people in a way that is incredibly dangerous no matter what your ideology is.
I totally agree. And I'm ashamed of the times that I made apologies for those agencies or this behavior. I really am. You are telling the truth. That's really clear. Glenn Greenwald, congratulations on getting out of there. Good to see you.
Thank you, Tucker. Appreciate it.
Okay. So he goes a little, he gets a little angry at the end there. Sorry about the anger. So what is actually going on? You're probably wondering, what the hell? I thought this was the BetaFiles. Why am I watching Tucker? Glenn Greenwald was the guy that Tucker was talking to, and I felt that'd be a good place to start. Everything that he was saying there. And then we'll move. What I want to show you now is how I found out about all this with Matt Taibbi's post on his Substack. Excuse me. And of course, if you're a regular follower of the BetaFiles, you're familiar with Substack by now. But anyway, this is the article that Taibbi ran almost a day ago. It looks like it came out last night. But the headline was in my inbox. It was Glenn Greenwald on his resignation from the Intercept. And of course, my jaw hit the floor. I was like, what is going on? Because earlier this week, and you're actually going to see a clip of this particular podcast, earlier this week, he was on Joe Rogan talking about preventing things like this from happening. And then 2 days later, after the Rogan podcast aired, it happened to him. the subline from Taibbi is the Pulitzer winner founded The Intercept to challenge official narratives and protect editorial freedom. When editors abandoned those principles, spiking a controversial story, he was forced to quit. So, if you go through all this, this is just basically covering in more detail what happened from another standpoint, from another point of view, with Taibbi's point of view. But this is the paragraph I want to focus on real quickly. The irony, Greenwald says, is that a media outlet I co-founded, which was built on my name and my accomplishments with the purpose of guaranteeing editorial independence, is now censoring me in the most egregious way about the leading presidential candidate a week before the election. And then, here we go. Greenwald becomes the latest high-profile journalist to leave a well-known legacy media organization to join Substack. You'll be able to read the piece rebuffed by The Intercept in his new site here, and we're actually going to look at that here in just a moment. You're probably thinking, okay, what the hell is going on? You're probably wondering. Okay, so let's go back. Let's take a trip back in time, all right? Let's get into the DeLorean and go to 85 miles an hour, or 88 miles an hour. 88, right? And watch the sparks fly. So, a couple weeks ago, as we talked about in the Optic Poet this week, so it was actually last week. So we're about a week and a half into this mess now. About a week and a half ago, the New York Post ran a story about Hunter Biden's emails and Hunter Biden's laptop. And of course, you probably heard about this by now. If you haven't, go find the story, okay? They ran the story. Now, the New York Post then posted it to both Facebook and Twitter, okay? And Twitter, well, first Facebook, okay? Let's talk about Facebook for a moment, and then we'll talk about Twitter. Facebook throttled it. In other words, they slowed down the amount. Here, let's kick back over for just a second. They throttled down the amount of reposts that the story was getting. Okay, so they slowed down the release of the story. Twitter just completely shut the story down. Okay, you were not able to, at that time, there's a wonderful video of Katie Halper on YouTube where she does it in real time. She tries to tweet the story, and Twitter throws up, all kinds of, you can't tweet this right now because it's disinformation. So Twitter shut the story down, okay? Here's something you got to understand about the New York Post before we go any further. And I talked a little bit about this in the Optic Poet. As when all this went down, I was like, I heard someone, I think it was Brett Weinstein, say, this newspaper is 200 years old. And I was like, really? The New York Post? Because the New York Post that I know is a Murdoch thing, right? So I go and I look up the New York Post, like the history of the New York Post. The New York Post was originally founded by Alexander Hamilton and a group of investors in response to Thomas Jefferson being elected president. Okay? Jefferson was leading the Democratic Party at the time. Hamilton was part of the Whig, what was the Whig Party, and then, of course, would eventually peter out in a couple of decades. But Hamilton, being a part of the opposing party, that guy that y'all love on Disney Plus right now, he started the New York Post so that they could publish stories against Jefferson, so that they could do their own reporting of the Jeffersonian presidency. That was the original mission of the New York Post, okay? Now, it was originally called the New York Evening Post. As time went on, they dropped the evening, all right? The New York Post is 54 years older than the New York Times and somewhere around 70 years older than the Washington Post. And, of course, it's hundreds of years older than Twitter and Facebook, okay? This is the... Glenn Greenwald actually mentioned this in the Rogan podcast. They're the fourth largest newspaper in the nation. Okay, Let me repeat that. The fourth largest newspaper in the nation. Okay? Now, let's talk about the sketchiness of the New York Post. In 1976, Rupert Murdoch bought the New York Post. Okay? And what his idea was to create an American version of the British newspaper, The Sun. Now, when we look at the British newspapers, the British journalism overall, okay, we talk about the BBC. The BBC is state-sanctioned journalism. It's for the people, okay? So it's kind of like their PBS almost, with a little bit more leeway. And then you have what's known as Channel 4, and there's a couple of others, right? Channel 4 is the big one. Channel 4 is an independently run station that has their own journalists, right? And they tend to report differently than the BBC does. There's more partisanship. Then when you get into the newspapers, you have a whole slew of variety, or a whole variety of different newspapers in Britain that are unashamedly, I don't even know if that's a word, but they're not ashamed to announce their political allegiance. So they don't care, okay? So if you're a right-wing newspaper writing about right-wing concerns, you don't try and hide it, like the Washington Times or the Washington Post, right? The Washington Post tries to hide their demographic. Actually, what's weird about this particular year, 2020 has just been just insane year. But one of the things that we're seeing is the Washington Post has all but said we are Democrats, right? And the New York Times is getting to that point as well. All right, now there are, it's the best known secret, right? Or the worst kept secret, or whatever it is, whatever the phrase is. That's what these news outlets, especially these newspapers, that's what these news outlets are. They're the worst kept secret in the world. We know that they're liberal. We know that they're conservative. We know that they're doing this stuff. We know, no matter how much they try and say they're fair and balanced. I had a friend tell me the other day that, the New York Times does real reporting. And I didn't say anything. I kept my mouth shut. But what I wanted to tell that person was, they all do real reporting, but it's at a slant, right? Whether you're talking about the cable news channels, which are blatant about it, or the newspapers that are becoming more blatant about it. Now, as far as the Biden story goes, I'll get to that in a minute. One of the things about the Hunter Biden story is that since the Post has published it, numerous outlets have verified the information. But what has happened is you have seen, or if you've been paying attention to it, what you've seen is just this concerted effort by the Democratic establishment, not the Biden campaign, the DNC, okay, by the DNC, to keep a lid on this story until Tuesday. We just got to get to, because they are so hell-bent on getting rid of Trump. It has gotten to the point where they are shutting down news organizations. And they have gotten Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Instagram. And this morning, TikTok announced, I heard a story on CNET this morning, that TikTok is now taking down questionable things from their service as in the run-up to the election. Are you kidding me? So here's the thing, and we're going to get back to Greenwald in a minute because he's a part of all this. He's the latest catastrophe to happen out of this New York Post story. When we look at the social media outlets, there's a weird catch-22. They are private corporations. One of the things I have argued for years is that it's not a matter of free speech when they cancel somebody, when they take somebody off their platform. It's a matter of what they want to do because they are a private company. They're a publicly traded company now, but because they're a corporation, they are not bound by the First Amendment, which is true, legally true. However, as Brett Weinstein has pointed out, where it gets tricky is that yes, they are a privately held company that's offering a broad public service. And because of the First Amendment, and I'm sure that this is going to, at some point, there's going to be a court case and they're going to argue about this. But because of the First Amendment, because this is even though they're a private company, they are offering a public space, they don't have as much right to limit the speech as, say, like, a Walmart. Okay. Now, Walmart can kick you out for saying the wrong thing in their store if it becomes a threat towards other customers in that store. But Facebook and Twitter are not necessarily bound by that principle, because it's weird, okay? What they do is they self-police, which is a good thing, because you don't want a lot of people inciting violence and, finding out and doxing people and finding out where they live and actually creating physical harm. However, on the flip side of that, there's a very thin line. And a lot of the people who, when you look at people like Milo Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro, Alex Jones, all these major players, specifically Milo and Alex Jones, right? When they've gotten removed from social media, a lot of proponents, when that happened, said, or a lot of people who were opponents, not proponents, but a lot of opponents to those moves by Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, what they said was, if you start there, where do you stop? Because eventually you're going to get down to almost a police-like state within these public spaces, right? And then, of course, what happens is you don't have to worry about the government limiting free speech. There's going to be enough pressure, private pressure between individuals, that they're going to censor themselves, right? And this will happen. It's already happening. There are a lot of journalists that are keeping their mouths shut right now just to get through Tuesday, because if they utter anything, they're going to get fired, or they're going to be forced to resign, or they're going to be forced to do something they don't want to do. We've already seen this summer. We saw this when the George Floyd stuff exploded and critical race theory ran rampant through the organizations, and we saw cancel culture go through the roof for a hot minute, right? Where they were just going after people for presenting facts, real honest to God facts, right? So that's where we're at. And we've gotten to the point now that the Democratic Party has got so much power consolidated in the media, in the liberal media, which has a larger footprint than the conservative media, has complete control over social media now. And I don't have to tell you about that footprint because it's global, right? And they are doing their damnedest to control exactly what you and I hear about Biden and, of course, his opponent, Trump. Now, we don't have to go into all the disaster that the Trump administration has been. And in no way am I advocating for that fucking administration. Okay? He's an idiot. He doesn't need to be president. On the flip side of that, when you look at Biden, if there are questions, he needs to answer them. Just like they've been pushing on Trump for 4 years, answer the question. Well, you need to answer the question too, Mr. Biden. Because this is all, they haven't denied, not one time have they denied that that's Hunter's laptop. They haven't confirmed it, but they haven't denied it. And that's basically confirmation, right? So what happened? So, of course, there were several different independent outlets that wrote about the fact that Twitter and Facebook were shutting this story down. And, of course, I've been screaming for a week and a half now, why isn't this the biggest story in the news? This should be the top story every fucking day of the news. Not the coronavirus, not Trump being a dumbass, not Biden, showing signs of dementia. This should be the top news story. Because the Democratic Party, through social media and legacy media, is trying to hijack this election to get rid of Trump. This is some third world bullshit. And what Glenn Greenwald did was write about one of the aspects that the Democratic Party is trying to use. He did what journalists are supposed to do. He's trying to raise awareness about this story. Now, Glenn Greenwald is not a Trump supporter. Glenn Greenwald is not a conservative. Glenn Greenwald is a gay man who's hiding in Brazil right now because the U.S. Department of Justice would love to get their hands on him because of the Snowden shit. So he's having to live in exile right now until the courts go through what they're going to go through with his particular case. And I'm not going to go into the whole Snowden thing. Or even the WikiLeaks thing. I don't really care for either one of those stories. But I mean, Snowden, never mind. See, I wanted to go down there. I'm not going down there. So let's take a look at what Mr. Greenwald actually said. So if you go to his Substack, this is what his Substack looks like. And he has, so far, he doesn't have much because he just opened this yesterday. He just started this yesterday. And I assume he'll probably do a backlog. Bring in stories that he's written over the years to start building up a decent library here. He's a fantastic writer, by the way. He's phenomenal. And he is one of those people that he's kind of like the South Park of journalism. He will go after whoever. You don't have to be left or right. He will go after you. It's kind of like Jon Stewart did back in the day. It doesn't matter, right? The three things that he's got so far are the emails, transcripts of the emails between he and the Intercept editors. And I'm going to show you a clip of an interview he did with The Hill this morning on Rising with Crystal and Zager. And he mentioned, now I'm not going to show you that part of the clip. I'm going to show you a different part of the clip from that interview. But he mentions in that interview that he wanted to post the email so that the concerns of the editors was also public, so that people could actually decide for themselves whether Greenwald or the editors were right. Okay? That's what journalists do. That's what a real journalist does. Lays it out for everybody. And then you decide what you want to believe, right? Here's the actual article that he pitched and they said no to. And then his resignation letter. So let's take a look at the resignation letter. Let's see what Mr. Greenwald had to say. And then we're going to jump back and watch a couple of clips from all this. And then I'll have some closing comments for you. So he says, today I sent my intention to resign from the Intercept news outlet I co-founded in 2013 with Jeremy Scahill and Laura, I don't know how to say her last name, so I'm just going to let it go, as well as from his parent company, First Look Media. The final precipitating cause is that the Intercept's editors, in violation of my contractual right of editorial freedom, censored an article I wrote this week, refusing to publish it unless I remove all sections critical of Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden, the candidate vehemently supported by all New York-based Intercept editors involved in this effort at suppression. The censored article, based on recently revealed emails and witness testimony, raised critical questions about Biden's conduct. Not conduct to simply prevent publication of this article as the media outlet I co-founded, these Intercept editors also demanded that I refrain from exercising a separate contractual right to publish this article with any other publication. I had no objection to their disagreement with my views of what this evidence... let me back up. I had no objection to their disagreement with my views of what this Biden evidence shows. As a last-ditch attempt to avoid being censored, I encouraged them to air their disagreements with me by writing their own articles that critique my perspectives and letting readers decide who is right, the way any confident and healthy media outlet would. And he's right. If you notice, one of the cool things about The Atlantic, and the reason why I'm still subscribing to The Atlantic and I'm reading The Atlantic almost every day, is because The Atlantic will post a very controversial story and then will post an opposing view of that story. So you get two views of that story. They're one of the few that actually still do this. Now, the Times, every once in a while, will do it, but the problem with the Times is they'll overload you with like 3 or 4 articles of one point of view, and then they'll have one op-ed that poses an opposite point of view. The Post does the same shit. I'm kind of angry at the 2 big boys right now because they're falling into this trap too. I left the Washington Post. I had a subscription to the Washington Post and I canceled it a couple weeks ago. Well, not a couple weeks ago, a few months ago, after they did that character assassination on that young lady about the Halloween party. You know, that was uncalled for. And I said, enough with the Washington Post. I'm done with them. I haven't gotten to that point with the Times, but my friend will be very upset with me if I get to that point with the Times. Anyway, where was I? But modern media outlets do not air dissent. They squash it. So censorship of my article, rather than engagement with it, was the path these Biden-supporting editors chose. That's kind of... He's angry. Censorship article will be published on this page shortly. It is now published here, and with the emails with Intercept editors showing the censorship is here, or are here. My letter of intent to resign, which I sent this morning to First Look Media's president, Michael Bloom, is published below. As of now, I'll be publishing my journalism here on Substack, where numerous other journalists, including my good friend, the great intrepid reporter Matt Taibbi, have come in order to practice journalism free of the increasingly repressive climate that is engulfing national mainstream media outlets across this country. Another reason why I feel safe moving the BetaFiles to Substack is because there are no limits. They will let you publish. If you can get these subscriptions, you can make, these guys can make a living off of it. I'll never be able to make a living off of it. If I do, it's going to be a miracle. But I can make, a part-time job equivalent. Hopefully, knock on wood. That's the point. But here's the thing that and Rogan points this out in his podcast with Greenwald earlier this week. There are a ton of big writers who are fleeing legacy media, what is called legacy media. This is the national media, okay? They're fleeing the national media because they're watching from the inside as these traditional media outlets are collapsing. And they're collapsing, not necessarily falling apart where they're going to go out of business, but they're collapsing in ideology. And they're buying into one or the other. There was a great moment in this week's Connors. Maybe I'll post that up in this episode as well. I don't know. We'll see. Because I have an idea for a different... Anyway, I got a surprise for you at the end. But there's a great moment in the Connors this week where Darlene and Dan are discussing what happened to Darlene's son at school because he got into a fight over a mask, right? He wanted to wear a mask. His friend didn't want to wear a mask, and his friend started criticizing him for wearing a mask. And so then he started to try and talk to the kid, and of course the kid didn't want to listen, and they got into a fist fight. And so Darlene and Dan Connors were both talking about this incident, and Darlene has the attitude of the younger generations in this country, which is they're not going to listen. We're going to have to, and this is the scariest point of view from all of this. What she said was, we have to vote everybody in to shut them up. And of course, Dan retorts, that's not how you do it. And he's right. That's not how you do it. You don't vote in one party to shut the other party up. You vote them in because they have better ideas. But they also have to yield to the other side. This is why I won't watch John Oliver anymore. And it's not because the U.S. history episode. A couple weeks later, he posted another episode about the 2020 election. And about halfway through the episode, he talked about one of the Democratic senator from West Virginia. His name escapes my mind right now. But he was talking about the senator, and he showed a clip of the senator, and the senator said, no matter what happens in this election, what we've got to do in this next Congress is find a way to get everyone to come and meet in the middle. Because that's the only real solutions we're going to have is once we get everybody to the middle and start finding compromises, right? And he's right, right? John Oliver, and this is a quote, said, "Fuck you." Because he said, we're not going to meet in the middle. We have got to get onto this liberal agenda. Are you kidding me? Because most of the stuff in the liberal agenda doesn't even affect rural farming life. Do you know why we have conservatives in this country? Because metropolitan politics don't matter to them. What matters to them are things that metropolitan residents don't have to worry about. Because it doesn't affect them. We've got a real breakdown in this country where one side wants to dominate and just control everybody without even thinking about the concerns of the rural voter. That's why Trump got elected, you dumbasses, because you weren't listening to the rural voter. You still think, if you look at the Democrats, the Democratic Institution, the DNC, they're talking about metropolitan elite politics. And they're ignoring the rural voters. This week on Unsafe Space, they talked about this NPR interview where one of the NPR radio reporters went in and talked to a guy from Minnesota who lives like 20 miles from Kenosha. Or excuse me, not Minnesota, Wisconsin. Who lives 20 miles from Kenosha, Wisconsin. And he's talking about how he's going to vote for Trump. And she brought up all these different things, different atrocities from Trump. This is a guy that lives in rural Wisconsin, 20 miles from Kenosha. Okay? And all the stuff that she brought up hasn't affected him. And he said, that's why I'm going to, what you're talking about doesn't matter to me. It hasn't affected me. And she got so angry with him. She talked down to him. The elite Democrat came out in her. And then he blew her off, which pissed her off even more. So, excuse me, it's a fascinating interview. When we see things like that, it's no wonder we have this disconnect, right? But the Democrat, the DNC right now, with their influence on legacy media and social media, they're trying to squash as many narratives as they can to control the larger narrative just to get them through Tuesday so Trump won't be elected again. I told my son earlier this morning, he was talking about how my youngest son, this is the one that can't vote yet. He can vote. He'll be able to vote in April. He'll be 18 then. But I told him, he said, my other son, I was telling him about the predictions, like it's 89% that Biden's going to win, about a 50% chance that he'll win in double digits. And my response to him was, well, if he wins, he wins. And if Trump wins, he wins. I mean, it's not in my hands anymore. It's out of my hands. It's out of all of our hands now. We just have to wait for the votes to be counted. Of course, they're not going to start doing that until Tuesday, when the official election day happens, right? At this point, the overall narrative that the left wing is pushing, and they're pushing it hard, is ignoring all these other things that are happening. And the biggest story, and I've already said it in this podcast, the biggest story nobody's talking about is the fact that they shut down the New York Post on Twitter and Facebook. The thing that really riled me up was the press secretary of the White House administration. I don't care what administration is in there. I don't care. You do not shut off the press secretary from the White House. If they're using an outlet to get out public information, to provide information to the public, you do not shut that down. And Twitter shut down her account because she reposted that New York Post article. I don't care what you think about the woman. I don't think much about her. I don't care what you think about her administration. You do not shut that down. Because the minute you shut down Trump, once a Republican gets a hold of it, they can shut the Democrat down. You're establishing a dangerous precedent. You let the information out and let the people decide. Do not tell the people what they need to understand or what they need to decide. That is the other dangerous thing, and Greenwald points that out as well. The purpose of journalism is not to make decisions for the people. The purpose of journalism is to provide all the information so that the public has the complete story and they can make the decision on their own. This is what journalism is supposed to be. Going back to Alexander Hamilton, he started the New York Post, established it, to report about the Jefferson administration. Things that he knew other outlets were not going to report on. That's how it started. And now, more than 200 years later, because it was established in 1801, I believe. More than 200 years later, they shut it down. Now, whether you like the New York Post or not, and I was talking to Jay about this the other day in our podcast, the problem with defending the New York Post is it's the New York Post. But as I was mentioning before, it's not meant to be like an American outlet. It's designed after a British outlet. And the British outlets are unashamed to admit their political allegiance. And that's what the Sun does. The Sun is very, at all of the British tabloids, all of the British stories, they're all the British outlets. They let you know what they are, who they're going to pull for. And the New York Post and Fox News has been that way for a long time. Fox News tried to hide it, like we couldn't figure it out. Then they finally just kind of let it go. And then MSNBC finally fell in check. It would be a lot easier if everybody else just said, yes, we are. You know, if the Washington Post just said, okay, we are a democratic institution. And I think we're heading that way. I think we're going to get to that point. I think you're going to see a conservative outlet rise up that's going to challenge the Times and the Post. The Times needs to go back to being truly unbiased. Something that hasn't been around since the early 80s. That's when they started their lurch left, right? All right. So let's look at, I want to look at the clip from Joe Rogan, from the Joe Rogan podcast when Greenwald was on Joe Rogan. And he's going to talk a little bit more about what I just was mentioning with the media. So let's do this.
There's so many folks that are dependent upon these large institutions, whether it's newspapers or television shows or whatever it is, and they can't freely express their concern with the way things are going because in many people's eyes, that's insignificant compared to get Donald Trump out of office. So everything goes by the wayside. Get Donald Trump out of office. That's number one. After that, we can concentrate on all those other things, but whatever you have to do to get Donald Trump out of office, save democracy. Someone actually sent me a message, someone I really like, and they sent me a message saying that they could get me an interview, but they want me to vote for Joe Biden. Come on, save democracy. This was the message that I got. And I was looking at this message on my computer, go, what the fuck is there a virus going on, like besides the coronavirus? Is there something that's like infecting people's minds and like snipping wires and disconnecting trains of thought? Like, what the fuck is happening? But guys like you, guys like Matt Taibbi, there's a few people out there that are sticking their neck out, and it gives me hope. It gives me hope that people are listening to you and people are reading your words and people are paying attention, and hopefully it's resonating, and hopefully some of these people that are doing this are realizing with shame that they're a part of this really disgraceful act that they're a part of this cowardly way of thinking and of not calling out all this shit. And if Joe Biden does get in office and they do see it declining even further and sliding even further down this disgusting trend that we find ourselves on right now, I hope they realize the error of their ways. But by then it might be too late.
But here's the problem. Here's what's worrying me the most, which is, you instinctively, that is something that you can kind of put your hope in, right? Is to say, well, look, there's an election in a week or, a few days, and all the polls suggest Biden's likely to win. And once Trump is out of the way, a lot of this insanity is going to disappear and things are going to kind of return to some degree of normalcy. And here's why I don't think that's true. So many institutions are profiting, I don't just mean financially, but in terms of power and control, from elevating fear levels over right-wing fascism, over white supremacists, domestic terrorism, whatever you want to call it. And obviously, this doesn't take a lot of insight to observe that historically the way you consolidate your power is if you can put people in fear. During the Cold War, you make everybody fear that the Russians and the communists are coming to take away your right to believe in God. And everybody says, build up a huge nuclear arsenal and don't use the money for our schools and our communities. Use it for the greatest military in the world and spy on everybody, and whatever you need to do to defeat this existential threat, do it. Obviously, after 9/11, that was the strategy of the Bush-Cheney administration. It's the way they consolidated a lot of power by elevating people's perceptions way beyond what it was real of the threat of Islamic terrorism to allow them to do essentially everything they did. The same exact thing is happening now, which is people in media have had their careers saved. I know cable hosts who are on the verge of being fired because nobody was fucking listening to their dumb shows in 2007 and 2008 when all they were doing is talking about how great Obama was, because who wants to listen to that? Trump, or 2015 rather, Trump was a godsend to them because Trump enabled them to elevate everybody's fear level and say this man who's coming isn't just another president. He's a grave threat to everything that's good in our lives. And it's not just him, but his entire movement behind him. Hundreds and tens of millions of people who are racist, who are hardcore white supremacy domestic terrorists. It caused MSNBC and the New York Times to explode with money. It caused the CIA and the FBI and tons of those neocon scumbags to rehabilitate their reputation and get back within the halls of power. Even if Trump loses the election, they're not going to just go back to now talking about Joe Biden because they know people are going to cancel their subscriptions and turn the TV channel again. They're going to continue to say, not maybe Trump or at least his movement, still pose this existential threat. They're out there plotting to kill people and impose white supremacy. And it's not that it's not true. It's not like there's not a kernel of truth to it. There are people doing that, but they're going to inflate it wildly so that any questioning of Joe Biden, even with Trump out of the picture, is still going to be depicted as, endangering American liberty, as helping fascism, as serving the agenda of the Kremlin. And the need for censorship as a result is going to be accepted by more and more people because of that fear that these media outlets and government institutions with whom they partner are going to be still instilling in people for their own benefit, for their own aim.
And obviously, I didn't go and create a new media outlet when I created The Intercept in order to impose greater limits on my own freedom. Nobody would do that, and I didn't either. So I've always had that freedom to publish directly to the internet without anyone intervening, which is why I've been able over the last 4 years to be able, for example, to publish so much skepticism about Russiagate when it was horrifying my colleagues at The Intercept who were on board with Russiagate and knew that it was making their liberal friends angry. It was only because I had that right. So that right is sacrosanct to me, to be able to express my views without having to negotiate the tone I'm using or what it is that I'm saying to appease other people's ideological preferences or their own views of what is correct or incorrect. And that's why I encouraged them. And I said, look, if you don't agree with everything I'm saying about the Hunter Biden emails, I totally understand that it's a very debatable issue, then you should actually go and write your own article and say why what I'm saying is wrong and air that debate, air that dissent instead of suppressing it. But the reality is that the reason they didn't want to do that is because in 2016, The Intercept was one of those publications, like the New York Times, that was blamed for Trump's winning because we did do a lot of reporting on the Hillary emails because that was our job as reporters. And they didn't want to spend the next 4 years, if Trump won, having their friends say, oh, look, you did it again. You published an article about Joe Biden before the election. Or even if Trump lost, saying, oh, look, you were trying to help Trump. That's the reality. They were captive to fears about what people on Twitter would say, what their friends and colleagues would say. And they just didn't want me reporting anything that would reflect on negatively on Joe Biden for that reason.
So, Glenn, The Intercept responded to you yesterday. I'll just read a part of what they say. They say the narrative Glenn presents about his departure is teeming with distortion and inaccuracies, all of them designed to make him appear as a victim rather than a grown person throwing a tantrum. You published your email correspondence yesterday with those editors over the said censorship of your article there. Could you just lay out the actual accuracies here about and address their response?
Sure. I mean, look, in order to explain to the public, including my own readership, why I was leaving the media outlet I created with great fanfare, I obviously had to be honest about my dissatisfactions with it. So I understand that the people who are still at The Intercept need to defend themselves, which means attacking me, and that's fine. But this is not a case where anyone needs to figure out who's telling the truth. I said from the beginning I was going to publish all of the information in the name of transparency that The Intercept has often failed to provide for itself, most notoriously in the Reality Winner case, where to this very day it never has explained to the public why that happened, how it happened, who did that. And I was furious about that. That was one of the major fights I had with them. And so I didn't want to be that way. So I published the correspondence, all of it I had with my editors surrounding their attempt to censor my article. And it was very clear what they said, which is, we're not going to let you publish this unless you remove all of the sections that talk about Joe Biden and Ukraine and Burisma and Joe Biden and China, and instead just make it a very narrow, much more stripped down version of this article by talking about your media criticisms. And I said, look, if there's a factual inaccuracy in the article, of course I want you to identify that, but you haven't. But I'm not going to take out the parts that are critical of Joe Biden and just make it a media critique, in part because on principle that's wrong, but also because the media critique that they didn't pursue this story aggressively enough makes no sense unless you explain why there's an important story here in the first place. And you can just see in the emails that was what they were saying. We're not going to publish this unless the sections about Biden are removed.
So there you go with those two clips. The first one being on Rogan, the second one being on The Hill, on Rising on the Hill. Here's the deal, and this is just where I'm so frustrated about all of this. And he points this out at the end of that Hill clip. With everything that's happening, and the idea of just tampering as much negative press as possible to keep Trump from happening again, what you end up with are very important news stories that are going to have long-lasting effects. Okay, now, the Hunter Biden story is not going to have long-lasting effects, right? This is going to be another one of those stories we talk about years from now, kind of like we do with Whitewater now, right? Whitewater, or trying to think of something else, the Patriot Act, or, those things. These are stories that are long in the past that got little coverage, but then, of course, afterward, we find out all this stuff, and then we talk about them. We're probably going to, same things are probably going to happen with Hunter Biden. The story's not going to go away. After Tuesday, regardless of who wins, the Hunter Biden story is here to stay. But what he's talking about is he couldn't talk about what happened with the media and the Post, because that was his main aim, was critiquing how the media handled the New York Post article, right? And how social media handled it, and how the whole thing just got crazy. But in order to talk about that, you have to talk about the story. Taibbi has published so far 2 articles on his Substack about this whole debacle. Okay, Glenn Greenwald actually wrote a story for The Intercept last week about the Facebook, Twitter thing, and his his focus in that particular article was going after Facebook and Twitter. But with this one, because of the media has jumped onto this bandwagon that the social media created. He had to talk about the story. He had to talk about the details of the story in order to show how the media is suppressing a lot of the information that has to do with this particular story and how they're trying to keep it as low as possible to keep Trump from happening again because of what happened with the Hillary emails. Here's the thing. The Hillary emails did not lose her the election. All you have to do, and I've been saying this for a while now, all you have to do is look at how she ignored middle America. These elite assholes that run the DNC refuse to recognize you've got to talk to the common man. The common man is the one who's going to vote you into power. Trump proved that. They refused to talk to these people. They couldn't stand Bernie. Why? Because Bernie was trying to talk to the common man. Yang tried to talk to the common man. Right? But that's not their agenda. Their agenda is power. It's consolidation of power. That's all it is. That's what the DNC is after. I promise you, it's not going to matter who wins on Tuesday. The agenda will move forward, regardless, for both parties. That's not conspiracy. That's just fact. Just look at all the elections up to this point. You can get as mad as hell as you want about Trump. You can get mad as hell as you want about Biden. The reality is it doesn't matter. The agenda is going to move forward. Right now, the DNC is trying to consolidate their power so that they can finally push the Republicans down and get their agenda. We saw all of this 10 years ago with the Republicans. The reason why the Republicans have so much power right now, the power that they have, and put it that way, is because of what they did 10 years ago. They did the same thing. They stopped at nothing to consolidate as much power as they could. And it worked. And now we're starting to see that shift back. It's going to shift back over to the Democrats. So, how can you say it's not going to matter? I mean, kids in cages. Why weren't you talking? Never mind. I'm not going down that road, right? Not going down that road. I'm not going to go down the climate change road because the reality is it's not climate change. Any kind of action towards climate change is not going to happen until the oil companies really get on board. Once they get on board, then we'll see actual movement towards climate change, like climate change policies. It's not going to happen until then because they're going to gum up the system. Same thing with guns. It's not going to happen until, the NRA gets on board. They're going to gum up the system. So you can scream and holler about the climate. You can scream and holler about the guns until the corporations get on board with it. It's not going to change. Nothing's going to happen. So kind of depressing, right? There is a bright side to all of this. People like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, and so many others, right? Have gone to do independent journalism through platforms like Substack and Medium. And because of that, a lot of really good reporting and fact-based news, not hearsay, but fact-based news, is being reported. You just got to go find it. The further we get away from the larger newspapers like the Times and like the Post and the Chicago Tribune, LA Times, right? And the New York Post. The further we get away, the more of us that push back and push away and walk away from those larger institutions, the less power they're going to have in dictating the narrative. It's about controlling the narrative. You want power, you got to control the narrative. And that's what they've been doing. So we got to take the people, and I know this sounds really stupid and patriotic, but it's honestly the truth. The people have got to take control of the narrative. They got to take it away from the elites. The elite class that is going to do everything they can to protect their shares. And they've got corporations that are there to help them protect their shareholders. They worked in tandem. It's about money and power. It's always been about money and power. It's the aristocrats against the bourgeois. Or against the proletariat, sorry. It's the bourgeois against the proletariat. The aristocrats against the common man. The lords against the peasants. It's the same story. Nothing has changed. And now we just got iPads. But it's pretty much the same. So, like I said, well, the one real ray of sunshine is that Wednesday morning, we're going to wake up and find out if Armageddon has happened. Isn't that fun? I predict that we will still be here Wednesday morning. All right. Make it a great day, as always. Be safe, be healthy. And here's a little treat for you. It made my day, made my week, made my year. Turned 2020 into a wonderful time. We'll see you next time.
Years of his life he poured into the Dodger organization, and you know he's watching and rooting. Ownership, Andrew Friedman, Dave Roberts. And strike three. Dodgers have won it all in 2020.